Naruto exclusive videos lemon come out on my Boosty. You can watch and subscribe. Link in the description. Enjoy watching. Description: it's clear to everyone that Naruto can't live without adventures. But life after the war turned out in such a way that the famous blonde had to gather dust, gnawing on the granite of science, trampling her way to her dream. Boredom. True, it turned out that adventures also can't live without Naruto. Take this, sign for it. The quest called Fall on Tobirama's Head begins. And Tobirama also comes with Hashirama and Madara. Now it definitely won't be boring. Chapter 1. Kurama had always known that Naruto had an indestructible spirit of adventure. And lately it had been all but buried under the dust of her boring training for promotion to the rank of Jonin. In those golden days of her boring everyday life, he sighed with relief, falling into suspended animation again, knowing that there was no need to worry about her bright head. There were no world-scale threats on the horizon, as well as threats of a lesser level. After the war, the world had stabilized, albeit shaky, and others were dealing with the problems, while Naruto was actively being trained for the position of Hokage. True, Naruto resisted the overly exaggerated zeal of the 6th to elevate her to the rank of 7th. As it turned out, the position of Hokage bored him. That was probably why Tsunade often took a swig from a bottle at work. But Kurama was happy with everything. And even more. He hadn't experienced such universal peace for a long time. Until her training led her to the secret archive of Konoha, where in addition to important documents, old relics were kept, including those from Uzushio, which had been completely destroyed. A layer of dust and barely perceptible vibrations of energy hovering around made her open her eyes, sniff, and become wary, not at all lazily. It was time to start forgetting about peace. After all, she had absolutely accidentally stumbled upon a scroll with a note like, "Don't meddle, it will kill you!" And under the bright inscription, promising death to anyone who opened or used it, there was small print, with a note about a small but. Only Uzumaki could open it and use it, though, if they were the strongest of the clan. Naruto snorted in displeasure, her eyes shining, and impatiently blew away the thick layer of dust and, with her usual carelessness, tore off the telling label, which, in her opinion, was boldly challenging her. She was the strongest of those alive, which perfectly smoothed out the disadvantage that she was only half an Uzumaki. The fox in the cage, sensing something ancient, definitely powerful and clearly dangerous in this scroll, blinked away his sleepy suspended animation in an instant, immediately bristling. "Okay. Relatively ancient. Put it back and don't touch it," he growled, all 9 of his tails, including his whiskers, paws, and nose, sensing the alarm bell. "Come on, what could be so terrible about it?" Naruto waved away his growl, curiosity breathing down her neck, and her inner spirit, set to search for adventures for her, but spread its wings, took a deep breath and shook itself, brushing off the dust. The mechanism was set in motion. "Just put the scroll back, okay?" Kurama couldn't explain what caused this feeling, which was relatively similar to panic, but the energy of this old parchment made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end every now and then. What if something like Kagaya is sealed there? The Biju didn't let up, trying to reach the common sense of his Jinchuriki as much as possible. The future Hokage, in his opinion, should have brakes. And if they don't work, then he will try to work for them. The fox could not ignore the fact that the scroll made him feel uneasy, unlike Uzumaki, who didn't give a damn about the aura of her find. "Old man, you're paranoid," Uzumaki waved him off and revealed her find, immediately disappointed. It was one of the masterpieces of Fuinjutsu, nameless, to her regret. And completely incomprehensible. Some kind of nonsense. Here. It's just some kind of seal. And I'll find out what it's aimed at now. Who knows, some super duper cool barrier that shreds enemies to pieces as soon as they pass through it, huh? And Naruto immediately unrolled it, bending over the paper. Interest spurred her on to find out what it was. And logically, evil of a universal scale cannot be sealed here, because such evil requires something much bigger than a piece of paper. Naruto came up with a startling conclusion. Well, at least she had some logic in order sometimes. Kurama snorted. Good. Her conclusions had solid ground. The scroll containing the Fuin and the key to its cage was the size of a 12-year-old Naruto, and Kagaya's cage, Luna. So yeah, whatever that little scroll was hiding wasn't scarier than him. That calmed him down a bit. But the hair on the back of his neck was still standing on end. Naruto had spent a good 3 hours crawling around and around the treasure he'd found from Uzushio's prime. It was during his prime, which meant around the time Konoha was founded, that this style of writing was invented, which opened up new horizons in Fuinjutsu, allowing one to connect the unconnected. It was her father who had used this style when composing a new seal for the Biju. And having sorted out her father's notes and his sketches of seals, she had mastered this style a little, but now it stubbornly refused to be deciphered. Sighing resignedly and blinking a couple of times, giving her eyes a rest, she began scanning it with her gaze again. And then she finally saw something like instructions containing only one line. Pour chakra here. And an arrow to the squiggle where you need to put your palm. Which meant that after 3 hours of useless attempts, she found the mechanism for starting what was hidden here. They came up with it for such impassible people. Lee sarcastically felt that there was a reason for such an inscription, and most likely it was a trap for a non-Uzumaki, because a pure-blooded Uzumaki, even in poor health and without much intelligence, would not pour his chakra into a suspicious Fuin. So, let's go! And it was definitely not about his Naruto. After all, Uzumaki's common sense is a beast that does not exist in nature. Kurama's hope for a better outcome died when Uzumaki put her palm on the squiggles, under which she found this barely noticeable inscription and arrow. Unlike his intuition, hers screamed that the scroll was not dangerous, and in general her intuition strangely resonated with the energy of the scroll, as if it were on the same wavelength. Contrary to the assurances of the Biju, she did not feel a drop of danger in the scroll, only a kiloton of interest, which translated into demonic, a ton of problems on Kurama's head. And under the loud, inarticulate swearing of the fox, who was pouring high-quality abuse on her bright head and restless but, she poured chakra into the scroll. But nothing happened. Fuin did not light up or spread out, or vice versa, didn't shrink to the size of just one pattern. Nothing happened to it. Pfft, this is a dud. Disappointment overwhelmed her instantly. And she had already imagined all sorts of things. And removing her palm from the paper yellowed with time, she realized that her palm would not come off. This is something new. Uzumaki jerked her hand, pulling it with all her strength, but it stuck tightly to the parchment, and that, in turn, to the floor. Did you eat it? Fox growled angrily, preparing for the worst and already shaking the dust off himself. At first she was scared, but then she calmed down abruptly. Internally she had the impression that this was how it should be. Fuinjutsu on this scroll was still working, even if it was just someone's joke. A dummy, you say? Fox became furious, watching with an unblinking gaze as the reserve of the Uzumaki catacombs dwindled. He did not share the paradoxical calm of his Jinchuriki. Pacifiers don't take away chakra in such quantities. There was desperate panic in his roar. So this seal doesn't have enough chakra, that's why nothing happened. Naruto, however, stubbornly did not share Kurama's worries, who was rapidly losing his composure, starting to scurry around the cage like a wild animal in anticipation of a natural disaster. She just humbly closed her eyes and, concentrating on the chakra flows, disconnected from the nervousness of the Kyuubi and began to pour into this scroll and the reserve of her furry cohabitant, simultaneously drawing natural chakra from the air. Fuin began to glow faintly. Kurama always knew that Naruto would not lead him to good, as well as himself. He simply forgot about it. His vigilance was lulled by her tedious studies and paradoxical perseverance coupled with a barely audible boring grumbling. After all, his vessel was on the home stretch to her goal. She did not even ask to go on missions, already anticipating that very sweet taste of victory, which was the source of strength that nailed her to the spot. All this made him languish and relax. And now he would pay for it with his 9 tails. And he felt the full deplorability of this situation, as well as Naruto's hopeless idiocy, only when her reserve was almost completely depleted, just like his own. Just a little more, and they will both pass away. Kurama did not have time to experience wild fear for his life and the life of his Jinchuriki, as he fell down as a powerless carcass, falling into unconsciousness. And at that very moment, the seal under Naruto's palm began to shine blindingly, coming into action. Uzumaki tried to pull her hand away from the scroll with the Fuin again, because she had filled the scroll with chakra, and she had to prepare for all conceivable and inconceivable consequences, but her hand was suddenly pulled down, the limb quickly disappeared inside the scroll, dragging her entire body along with it. She did not even have time to squeak, as she was completely absorbed by an unknown, and apparently, truly life-threatening seal. It seemed that Kurama was right. Tobirama was still skeptical about the Senju and Uchiha teaming up. His personality was the main factor. He couldn't trust the enemy a priori. Perhaps he had big trust issues because of the war. Secondly, it's Uchiha. It would be fine if it was just Uchiha, but Madara, according to Tobirama, was the root of evil and the stronghold of all that was worst in man. True, Hashirama had a different opinion. Inversely proportional. And the fact that Hashirama was twining around the most cruel and bloodthirsty Uchiha, running and jumping around him, did not please him at all. He was skeptical about his brother's idea to build a village. Nothing good would come of it. Just like the amazing unity between his brother and Madara. And no, Tobirama wasn't jealous of his brother towards Madara. Not at all. He just felt sick being around the Uchiha. Perhaps because he felt concentrated and subtly directed hatred towards him from Madara. Not only was it uncomfortable, but the worm of guilt for Izuna's death began to gnaw at his conscience with tripled force. And here will be the archive. Hashirama, inspired, was ranting, not only looking but also circling with his hands the place where he saw the archive for the future documentation of the village. Madara chuckled something reservedly. Apparently consent, Tobirama had not yet learned to decipher his laconic and pft. Hashirama beamed like a polished copper teapot. The younger Senju looked around, pushing his hatred for Madara to the back burner. The place was not particularly suitable for habitation due to the peculiarities of the landscape, but it was suitable for such outbuildings. Tobirama also had no objections. He cared little about the location of the buildings, but the gloomy Uchiha, yes, he did. And no, Tobirama is not obsessed with hatred towards the Uchiha. He just doesn't trust this red-eyed clan. Madaran's sullenness and gloomy aura caused him not only discomfort and pressure on his conscience, but also terrible tension. He was constantly expecting a trick, or rather a carefully thought-out murder of his person. Madara clearly wanted revenge. The Uchiha were all obsessed with revenge for their loved ones, and Senju doubted that Madara had broken this vicious circle. He didn't trust him at all. And at this very, finely planned attack that Tobirama imagined, didn't take long to come. Something literally fell on his head, knocking him off his feet. Although he was always on guard, especially near the Uchiha, the brave shinobi's instincts failed him. And he fell to the ground with this something, painfully bruising himself. Tobirama was sprawled on the ground, caught off guard, coughing hard from the dust he had raised. And something heavy was pressing on his chest, trying to squeeze the last of the oxygen out of his lungs. Sparks flew out of his eyes from the impact of his head on the ground. Senju was incapacitated and brazenly disoriented for a couple of seconds, which would have been enough to take his life on the battlefield. But no one was in a hurry to take his life, although Madara would have needed only a miserable second to do it. Having mastered himself, he wanted to reach for the kunai, but Madara was faster. Faster than his thoughts. Not to mention actions. Here, proof that Madara can be faster than thought, perhaps even sound. But the cold steel did not take his life, which even upset Senju. And everything was going so well, and then, lo and behold, Madara was in no hurry to kill him. Uchiha! Show off! He simply pulled this someone off Tobirama, who was sprawled on the ground, set him on his feet, and prudently pressed the blade of his kama, which flashed angrily in the rays of the daytime sun, to his thin neck. And all this at incredible speed and with deadly grace. Oh, second, the blonde squeezed out nervously, her eyes wide open at the albino. And then she went limp in Uchiha's arms, losing consciousness, almost ripping her own neck open, accidentally committing suicide. Only Madara's reaction, who put his weapon away in time, saved her from a stupid death. "I'm going to the police station," Uchiha said calmly, and throwing the unconscious female body onto his shoulder, he disappeared with it in a whirlwind of shunshin. Tobirama was seething. Gritting his teeth, he glared at the place where Madara had stood a moment earlier. "Relax, brother," Hashirama slapped Tobirama on the shoulder, smiling, knowing full well that he suspected Madara of this incomprehensible attempt on his life. Tobirama only clenched his teeth tightly, rose from the ground and angrily hissed, "I'm after him," and using the still not fully completed seal of the Thunder God, he disappeared after him. Chapter 2. It's obvious. The stranger was awaited by a police station that was still not fully built, where the post of temporary head was occupied by, who would have thought, Uchiha Madara. Tobirama, ever vigilant and always looking for a catch in everything, was partly sure that Madara was saving his accomplice. But common sense, not completely buried under the ashes of hatred, assigned the situation the symbol of logic. Of course, girls falling from the sky, who, by chance or under the influence of evil intent, landed right on the head of one of the strongest in the Senju clan, need to be dragged in for interrogation. Preferably with partiality. It's logical. That's how it should be. Tobirama arrived at the department at the very moment when Madara sat the girl, who still hadn't come to her senses, on a chair and began taking precautions. Began to tie her up. As the saying goes, Rikudo protects those who are careful. Look, there was even a bunch of weapons in the corner of the room. Kunai were prevalent. Uchiha managed to disarm her. So the stranger, shinobi. Although, it is no exaggeration to say that such measures are unnecessary. The mere sight of Madara can paralyze an enemy. As can Tobirama. The fame of their strength, let's not forget about Hashirama, and abilities is spread throughout the continent. But let's not be too self-confident, because only the Bijou knows what surprises this person hides within herself. Madara ignored Tobirama's presence, while Tobirama, on the contrary, did not take his eyes off the Uchiha. When Madara finally tied strong knots, immobilizing the criminal's limbs, and stepped aside to take a chair and sit opposite the stranger, Tobirama could not resist and approached her. A snort full of contempt with intonations of mockery dug into his back. Tobirama, clenching his teeth tighter, curbed the internal storm, and began checking. Were the knots on the fetters strong? Did she have a weapon lying around somewhere? He even felt her disheveled, blonde hair sticking out in different directions, almost like Madara's. Well, so what? No one has yet cancelled hairpins smeared with poison. And only then did he calm down. If Madara knew how to roll his eyes, perhaps he would have, judging by the expression on his face. So what do we have here? Hashirama literally destroyed the tension that hung between the two with his overly cheerful and happy voice, flying into the interrogation room. Unlike the two, the elder Senju did not share their mood. Tobirama rubbed the bridge of his nose in irritation. His brother was so careless. Taking the mutual silence of Tobirama and the Uchiha as a very meaningful answer, Hashirama became embarrassed. Not for long. Because the next second, with overflowing enthusiasm, he jumped up to the girl, scanning her with medical chakra. Minutes passed, Hashirama was still spinning around the unknown girl, clearly trying first of all to assess her condition, maybe even treat her. After all, she had presumably fallen off a cliff, but not to bring her to consciousness right away. The younger Senju was losing patience. He needed answers. Urgently. Hashirama, step aside, Tobirama said in a tone that brooked no argument. And Senju Sr. obediently walked away with the look of a naughty kitten. And really, he most likely felt sorry for the poor thing. He was treating her, not bringing her to her senses. Tobirama, having folded the seals, sent a sphere of water towards the stranger. When it was exactly above the drooping golden-haired crown, he lowered the water ball onto her head. It should cheer her up. The blonde nervously jerked her whole body, shaking her head when the water, no longer held back by Tobirama, poured over her. But she did not wake up. Tobirama repeated the manipulation. His methods were more useful. When there was not a dry spot left on the girl, and a decent puddle formed under her feet, she began to come to her senses. She began to come to her senses after the first bucket of water. The cool moisture, running in streams from her hair and getting into the collar of her jacket, was noticeably so invigorating. But Naruto was in no hurry to open her eyes or to show in any way that she had come to her senses. It was not for nothing that she was a shinobi, after all. First, it was necessary to analyze the situation, and only then throw herself with her fists into the thick of things. The last thing she remembered was that she was mercilessly spat out of the hole she had been sucked into, onto the second. Even being completely disoriented, with stifled breathing, terrible dizziness, and colored spots in her eyes, she stood right in front of Senju Tobirama. She ignored the fact that her throat could be ripped open at any moment by a very sharp blade of some weapon. Although, it really unnerved her instinct for self-preservation. But that's not important. What's important is that she stood in front of the second Hokage. Now dead. Deeply mrtdg. And if the dead Hokage stands in front of you as if he were alive, what does that mean? Right. You died. Well, or you accidentally stumbled upon the Edo Tensei technique. True, there was no sign of this jutsu. So, the first option? It is best to believe in a very cozy and safe I hit my head, that's why it seems like everything is going on here. Well, at worst she opened a powerful genjutsu. Still, the scrolls marked, "Do not interfere, will kill." You shouldn't open it. Even if you are very, very curious. And very, very strong. By the way, it is suspicious that Kurama is silent. He warned her. But you don't hear the caustic, "I told you so," and other variations of this phrase. And this is a bad sign. Cool water continued to bring her out of the dark. Nothing. How many buckets have been poured on her already? Judging by the fact that there is almost no dry spot left on her, a lot. It was time to face the crushing reality, and not sit and pretend to be an unconscious body. With a shudder in her entire body, she opened her eyes, immediately meeting the gaze of the Manjikyu Sharingan. A complex black pattern gleamed menacingly on the red iris, promising at the very least something very unpleasant. And coupled with a shock of disheveled, long black hair sticking out in all directions, suspiciously similar to Madara's own hairstyle, it was hellish torment. This made her immediately close her eyes and lower her head. Looking into red eyes is a bad omen. Very, very bad. "Who are you?" the stranger asked her. His voice was calm, very similar to the rustling of leaves in the forest, instilling a certain sense of security. Probably deceptive. In an interrogation room, even the air can be far from safe, let alone people. Naruto was in no hurry to answer. Each word must be carefully considered before opening her mouth. She was not only uncomfortable under the oppression of the aura of unconditional power hanging in the air, but also anxious. Any remark she made could bring her even more problems than her current situation. The prolonged silence clearly strained those who were interrogating her. Their response to her silence was not long in coming. They roughly grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to raise her head, and pulled so hard that she even squealed from the flash of pain in the back of her head. The main thing is not to open your eyes. It had hurt worse. And she had been in more hopeless situations. Hello Kagaya. And scary dot, what a pity we don't have Yamanaka. This voice thickened the colors with its phrase. Naruto felt how the emanation of danger emanating from the man with the Sharingan and Madara's appearance sparkled with new colors, causing her to involuntarily shudder. The tension in the air smelled of ozone, foreshadowing an imminent thunderstorm. They will be soon, we are in the final stages of concluding a truce, this was said by the one who spoke first. After this phrase, her hair was roughly pulled again, throwing her head back even more. There was a crunch in her vertebrae, and pain began to creep up from the back of her head again. Uzumaki closed her eyes until colored spots appeared before her eyes. Kami-sama, what had she gotten herself into? Did the Yamanaka betray Konoha and make a pact with some other hidden village? Naruto thought feverishly. What to do? Tied hands are not a problem for a shinobi of her level, but those who were in the same room with her are definitely a problem. Her insides were irritated by the echoes of the chakra of those present. They tried to put pressure on her morally, not hiding their level of strength and flavoring her consciousness with a portion of the most powerful chi. And she had a much more serious problem. There was almost no chakra left in her, and the fox was silent. Where did you get Madara's Sharingan? Suddenly she was found. The best counterattack. This is an attack. Where did you get it? It's disgusting. She grimaced in disgust, and quite naturally. It was such a disgusting thing to steal the dojutsu from the TRPVs and then experiment on it. It seemed that after her words even the drops from her hair stopped dripping onto the ground, and a deafening silence fell. And it lasted only a few seconds, so that the laughter that followed this pause deafened her and hit her nerves. Her imagination immediately drew her a laughing Madara on the battlefield. Her consciousness was either playing with her, or persistently shoving the clue to the identity of the false Madara under her nose. Girl, you seem to have hit your head really hard on Tobirama's stubbornness. Now the man sitting opposite spoke, who possessed the Sharingan and resembled the most brutal ninja in the history of the shinobi world. His timbre, intonations were just like the final touch, completing the image of the man opposite. And the name that escaped from his lips revived the last image of Tobirama. Are you really Madara? She didn't dare open her eyes. Under the pressure of the Manjikyu Sharingan, they could learn a lot from her. Not Yamanaka, of course, but they could still pick at her brains so much that it would be a pain in the ass. Damn it! They could have already picked at her brains. How could she dispel genjutsu? The real deal, the man assured her, loosening his grip on her hair, and then completely removing his hand from her. Hashirama, when you checked her, did she have any head injuries? Naruto stretched her stiff neck, feeling free. The skin on the back of her head itched painfully, as did the thoughts in her head. Hashirama? Tobirama, Madara, and Hashirama, Madara, Hashirama and Tobirama, she whispered to herself incessantly, clearly deeply shocked, trying to reconcile these three images with the current reality. She's more than fine, said the one with the pleasant voice, which caused a feeling of calm for no reason. Naruto immediately mentally calculated that if she added more firmness and steel to this voice, it would be very similar to the voice of Hashirama, whom she had the honor of meeting in the war. All the color immediately drained from her face. Then let's continue the interrogation, but to the third voice. Tobirama's voice became steel and firm. Naruto could not remain in ignorance any longer and opened her eyes, having previously stopped the flow of chakra a couple of times to shake off all sorts of genjutsu, quite successfully avoiding the dangerous gaze of the Sharingan. Sharply shaking her head, she turned in the direction from which the other voices were coming and saw Hashirama and Tobirama frozen to the side. And they looked more alive than all the living. Naruto trembled with her whole body, accepting the reality that had fallen on her head. Her lower jaw smoothly went down, her breath caught, and her eyes were ready to jump out of their sockets, very clearly demonstrating the extreme degree of surprise. Madara would not be Madara. He didn't lose his head and immediately extended his hands to her head, turning her towards him, immediately looking into her blue eyes, huge from shock, pulling her into a genjutsu dot. Nothing, Madara almost hissed, thereby expressing almost the extreme degree of rage. Tobirama frankly enjoyed the impotence of the head of the Uchiha clan. No, he was also angry that they learned absolutely nothing. But to a greater extent, he was pleased with Madara's failures. Tobirama knew very well that the formidable Uchiha could crack a spy with just his appearance, and torture an experienced one with his genjutsu so that he would sell his own mother for a pittance, and himself for organs at the same time. Tobirama and Hashirama could also obtain information using completely inhumane methods when circumstances required it. The girl was not afraid of them, although she recognized them. She only turned pale and was surprised, but did not show fear. And the psychological technique of scare her with your aura to the point of wet pants did not work against her. Hashirama admitted that he felt a large center of chakra in her when he scanned, but it was critically empty. The stranger was on the edge. Now the version that she fell off the cliff did not seem so fabulous. If it became more or less clear that she fell on Tobirama purely by accident, then who is she, where is she from, and what are her goals, remained a mystery. And one that was beyond Madara's capabilities. As soon as she started asking questions while she was in a deep genjutsu, Madara was thrown out of her subconscious, and the genjutsu dissolved, and the blonde lost consciousness. Hashirama even had to resuscitate her a couple of times. So that it wouldn't protect her from such a rude interference in her brain, it fed on chakra, and she had almost no chakra. Tobirama was generally against resuscitation actions. She was a complete question and a headache for them. Madara was of the same opinion, but the soft-hearted and kind-hearted Hashirama could not let her die. So the girl was still alive, but unconscious. Well, what if it comes in handy? She has a large reserve, maybe she's a clan one. Strong shinobi are worth their weight in gold, Hashirama justified himself, catching the condemning glances of his brother and comrade. If she's strong, who's going to guard her? Sooner or later, her reserves will be restored, and then what? What if she's a spy? There must be techniques that hide the mind from outside interference, since Uchiha can't complete the interrogation. Or she's a murderer. Not everyone is thrilled with your idea, you know. Tobirama tried to reason with his brother with cold logic. She will live until we find out who she is and what she forgot on the territory of the village under construction. Enough bloodshed, Hashirama's voice clearly rang with steel. Once the Yamanaka clan arrives, we will conduct the interrogation again. She can cause bloodshed. Tobirama could name another 20 reasons why this stranger shouldn't be left here. And anyway, he's trying his best here so that his brother's dreams don't go to waste when it turns out that they've warmed a snake around their neck. Madara is enough for them. More precisely, he and most of the future village, who were wary of the head of the Uchiha clan. We will keep it under control. The head of Senju was adamant and terminally ill with altruism. We? Tobirama glanced at Uchiha, who was standing apart from the brothers' quarrel, ignoring the brewing scandal. He continued to sit on the chair opposite the girl, closing his eyes and abstracting himself from reality. Don't count on me. Tobirama had enough headaches without this. After all, he shared the duties with his brother, helping him realize his dream. And Madara wouldn't do something so dubious. He also had enough worries, because, unfortunately for him, the Uchiha also shared the duties with them in trying to build a hidden village. I'll keep an eye on her, Madara said calmly and opened his inky black eyes, looking at the girl. And Tobirama was ready to swear that he saw sparks of interest in them. No, it seemed so. It was just that the ropes that fixed the limbs of this blonde caught fire, and the flames were reflected in the mirror of Madara's eyes. But still, he was not happy that this woman, whoever she turned out to be in the end, would live among them. Especially if Madara dragged her to the territory of his clan, and she would constantly be in the company of the Uchiha. He could not allow this. Sighing heavily, Tobirama scratched the bridge of his nose. Hashirama loved to complicate his life. Now he would not just leave this little brat under the supervision of the Uchiha clan, and in particular Madara. A potentially strong girl with a non-potentially strong Uchiha could turn out to be an explosive mixture. Chapter 3. For some reason, lately she has not been pleased with her own memories of her last minutes in consciousness. First the second, then the living and frighteningly real founders in full combat gear. This definitely does not bode well. Again, she should have listened to Kurama and not meddle where she was not asked. Whatever this was, it was having a bad effect on her. It was scary to think that all this was as real as possible. Because it was definitely impossible. It was easier to perceive what had happened to her as delirium or genjutsu that could not be dispelled by ordinary means. It smelled like a pile of problems. But whatever it was, she had to sort it out, and, apparently alone. Kurama was still silent. It would have been better if he had poured out an accusatory speech on her head, destroying her conscience, than keeping his mouth shut. Having come to his senses again, but not in a hurry to open his eyes, what if those scary black and red Sharingans of Madara are still looking at her, Naruto tried to understand where she was. Her position was no longer sitting, but lying down. Her arms and legs were not tied. This was good. Her body was warm and cozy, completely dry. She was lying on the tatame, covered with a thin blanket. A light breeze caressed the exposed areas of skin, creating the illusion of an idol. Everything was fine, except for the oppressive aura that hung in the air, as did the sweet, persistent aroma of cherry blossoms. The alien chakra was similarly irritating her insides, like the smell of sakura was irritating the receptors of her nose. "Who are you?" Madara had a pleasant voice when he wasn't on the battlefield. A couple of degrees of intonation cooler than Sasuke's. Such a tone from the bearer of the Uchiha surname could be considered friendliness. And such verbosity was due to the fact that he discovered that she had come to her senses, she just wasn't in a hurry to open her eyes. "Young woman," Uzumaki rolled over and looked at Madara, showing that she wasn't afraid of him, although being in the same room with a living legend was life-threatening. Madara had amazing patience and nerves of steel. He ignored her caustic answer, not reacting to it in any way. "Naruto," she backed down, realizing that there was no point in stirring up this hive, no matter how deceptively calm it seemed. "And the clan?" Madara sat in the corner of the room, a motionless statue in the lotus position. A damned sharp kama stood against the wall, catching the rays of the sun on its blade. Naruto knew that in tandem with the Uchiha, they were dangerous. "Clanless," Naruto answered cautiously, choosing the path of lies. But she had to lie carefully, so that the lie would not lead her under that very blade of the scythe, brightly shining in the rays of the sun. "Orphan. And they shouldn't know that she bears the surname of her mother's clan. Uzumaki is a prominent, famous surname here. And to be called by her father's surname, it's not worth taking that risk either." Madara didn't show any feelings at all. Naruto couldn't tell if he believed her or not. She also couldn't tell if she believed that Madara was sitting in front of her alive. A dual state. "Where am I?" She sat down, throwing off her blanket. She was not dressed in her usual suit, but in a dark blue yukata. They changed her clothes. How caring, it turns out. "In the land of fire," Madara answered without taking his eyes off her. "And more specifically?" Uzumaki fixed her gaze on Uchiha in the same way, knowing full well that he had responded in the same manner in which she had begun to respond. It seemed like an honest answer, but not what she wanted to hear. "This place doesn't have a name yet, but I would call it Kanahigakure no Sato." Madara's right corner of her lip twitched, hinting at a smile. And her gaze became softer for just a moment. And here again was a stone incapable of emotion before her. "How poetic and subtle," Naruto said, confused, stunned by what she heard. "The village hidden in the leaf." She was home. True, almost 80 or 90 years ago, if I were to guess. She tried to smooth over her shock with a wide smile. In her mind, she convinced herself that she should take this for granted, and not something impossible. Hysteria suddenly tickled her nerves. Madara closed his eyes, his features became even softer. It looked very much like approval of her reaction. But Naruto did not notice this, looking as if through him. She in the past. In the past. Or were these hasty conclusions that the approaching hysteria dictated to her in order to accurately provoke an emotional outburst? It was easier to think that she was in the afterlife or genjutsu. "Are you a mercenary?" Madara noticed her confused state. But she was still looking at him, not really seeing him, lost in her own thoughts. Her eyes were shining suspiciously, hinting at tears. But he didn't have enough tears here. Something told him that she was going to cry naturally, and not feign any emotion. And if it came to tears, then she would be able to drown him in them. The girl was very emotional. "I ask, are you a mercenary?" Madara decided to give her a shock therapy. He shouldn't be whining here. Just a moment ago he was sitting in the corner, away from the pile of problems imposed by Hashirama, and now he was sitting right in front of her, almost nose to nose, releasing his ki. Naruto immediately perked up and tensed up. Her gaze became meaningful and focused on his face. Like any other shinobi, she was ready to get involved in a fight at any second. as her posture and gaze, in which there was not a grain of fear, spoke. Yes, she squeezed out, digging her fingers into her own hips, suppressing the desire to grab the face opposite her. After all, completely different reflexes were triggered. Madara in her eyes was a monster, second only to Kagaya in his cruelty. And monsters must be fought. What are you doing here? Madara was in no hurry to move away, continuing to play on her nerves. Perhaps he would even like to provoke her into a fight. With her fearlessness in front of him and Hashirama's statement about her potentially large chakra reserve, she aroused interest. Initially, he followed Hashirama's lead only because he could not open her brain. And then the statement about her potential power heated up his interest. The point in this matter was Tobirama's desperate zeal to kill the girl, without trying to get to the bottom of it. As always, the younger Senju was a stronghold of common sense and cold calculation. And Madara mentally supported Tobirama's point of view. Getting rid of a potential threat was very logical. But the grain of irrational interest, and his own pride prevented him from supporting Tobirama. Madara has a habit of doing everything to spite Senju. Hashirama does not count. Nothing, Naruto said simply, realizing that she needed to give an answer as soon as possible. And if she didn't distract herself with conversation, she would definitely try to get into a fight, or fall into hysterics. The old feelings that this Uchiha had evoked in her were blooming and smelling. And she hated Madara. You're lying, the blade of the Kama touched her chest. The land is full of rumors. I heard that they were building a village. I decided to try my luck. Maybe I want to live here? To settle down, to live a different life, Naruto blurted out hotly, beginning to flare up with rage, redirecting the seething hatred for the Uchiha into a passionate speech. She was almost shaking from the excess of feelings. So much had fallen on her, and this was preventing her from comprehending the current state of affairs and developing tactics and strategy for behavior. I feel it in my heart this is my home, but life has been rough on me on the way here. She leaned forward, causing the tip of the blade to painfully dig into her skin. The stab of pain somewhat cooled her desire to tear her hands away from the fabric of the borrowed yukata and lower them to the Uchiha's neck, and she didn't care that now she was weaker than ever before, and that she was in for an unconditional defeat. Are you satisfied with this answer? Not really, Madara put away his weapon. He had a tough nut to crack. And a completely crazy one at that. Outrageously fearless, desperate, and also terribly daring. And that's your problem, Naruto muttered, allowing herself to relax, breathing a sigh of relief. She didn't inspire confidence in him, but she did take away his desire to attack. And he would have definitely attacked her if he hadn't liked her answer. He would have plunged the blade of his scythe into her chest up to the hilt, and wouldn't have batted an eye. No, that's your problem, Madara pulled away from her, suppressing his chakra. It wouldn't work with her, apparently. Not a single muscle moved when he directly threatened her. She didn't even catch her breath. And there was a furious flame in her eyes, not fear. She didn't back away from the deadly blade, but on the contrary, she leaned forward. She was challenging him with her behavior. She definitely needed to be watched closely, since she was so fearless. Maybe there was some stupidity hidden behind that bravado, but Hashirama's words about her chakra reserves. She would have to try hard to earn his trust. Especially his. Nasty Uchiha, Uzumaki hissed, clearly unhappy with what was happening. She closed her eyes and leaned her back against the wall, relaxing. It seemed that she had earned a certain amount of trust after all. At the same time, her bravado in front of Madara had managed to shut up the hysteria for now. Don't go out unless you want to get killed. Before evaporating in a cloud of shunshin, Madara advised. And I didn't intend to, she snorted in response. She had a lot to think about. For starters, at least to understand where she was and what was happening to her, meditation did give results after all. She sank into the subconscious. True, she had to waste most of the day for this. The panic that periodically rolled in waves prevented her from relaxing completely and fully, as did heavy thoughts. Kurama was still silent, which did not add bonuses, but only aggravated the situation. Therefore, finding herself in the depths of her subconscious catacombs, she went in search of the bijou. By the way, the catacombs were catastrophically empty and quiet. There was very little chakra in it. The floor, which was usually hidden by water chakra, was absolutely dry. Whatever this seal was, she drank its chakra almost to the bottom. What if this seal drank all the chakra from the bijou? The bijou is completely made of chakra. Naruto trembled and shook her head, driving out joyless thoughts. Nonsense! If she had drunk all of Kurama's chakra, Naruto would have died. And she, alive and well. But the grains of common sense cruelly trampled her hope. It was unclear whether she had died, in the past or in Genjutsu. The afterlife could well be like Konoha during the Founder's time. People don't come back from the afterlife to tell what awaits them beyond. Howling desperately, she set off in search of the place where her demon was huddled, her heart jumping out of her chest with fear. She hadn't felt this for a long time. How brainless she was! She had dragged them into who knows where. Curiosity had ruined Naruto, like that famous cat. From now on, she needed to cool her specific craving for everything incomprehensible, potentially dangerous, and predicting something exciting and interesting. Otherwise, it would end badly. If it hadn't already happened. Still, her wanderings had not been in vain. She came out into a spacious hall, where the giant bars of the fox's cage were visible. Kyubi was not there. No, Kyubi loved to dramatize. He had often frightened her in the past, hiding in the shadows of the catacombs, terrifying her with his eyes shining with all-consuming malice and rage, and his fangs bared in a bloodthirsty grin. Now there was emptiness. All-consuming, and therefore frightening. Kurama! Naruto screamed in panic, and, filled with fear, rushed to the cage. Not only did she not see the demon, she also did not feel his aura. And what a connection they had! They pumped him up during the war, and after. Did she die after all? And these are echoes of her past life? Tears flowed in streams. Naruto sobbed bitterly as she ran between the bars into the abode of her demon. Despair and guilt choked her from the inside. Kurama! Uzumaki ran around the empty cage like a toy, trying to catch up with her elusive hope in an attempt to find the fox. But his massive bulk, which could hardly be hidden so well in a confined space, was nowhere to be found. And could not be, common sense whispered cruelly. Naruto fell to her knees, as if mown down, when there was no point in denying the obvious. Hiding her face in her hands, she continued to sob uncontrollably. And then someone began to grunt at her in a very unfriendly way. Something soft and warm slid along her right side, and then something sharp dug into her bruised and already pulsating knees. The pain sobered her up, forcing her to swallow the gurgling sounds of hysteria that were trying to get out and to calm down for a while. Taking her hands away from her face, she looked at her knees. Something sharp continued to dig into them deeper. Something brown-red was spreading before her eyes because of her tears. Furiously smearing the tears across her face in an attempt to dry her still watery eyes, she tried to see what had so brazenly and painfully disturbed her suffering. A fox was sitting by her knees. Not a fox, but a fox. The small, fluffy creature had a brownish-red shade of fur, red eyes, a black mouth with sharp teeth, and 100% sharp claws that mercilessly tore the flesh on her knee. Having gained her attention, the animal deigned to pull the claws out of her body, while looking with such a murderous gaze that goosebumps ran down Naruto's spine. If not for its small size, perhaps it would have bitten her throat. The fox was smaller than its relatives, but clearly much more bloodthirsty. No, its height would not prevent it from biting her throat. The four-legged creature again growled at her, yelped, growled, jumped onto her lap and, stretching very gracefully, stood on its hind legs, resting its front legs on the collarbone area. Now the fox was at the level of her face. He did not finish his tirade. He only growled even louder and snapped his sharp teeth right in front of her nose. Naruto froze in shock, completely unable to understand what was happening. Where did foxes come from in her subconscious? Ordinary foxes? This ball of fur looked like an ordinary fox, though not as shabby as the ones you usually find in the forest. The fox, sensing her shock, fell silent and shook his small head, completely naturally rolling his eyes. His face suspiciously clearly outlined his attitude towards her mental abilities. The calm passed. Looking at the fox's face, her lips began to tremble again and large tears welled up in her eyes. Snorting contemptuously, the fox jumped off her lap and turned his back to her, demonstrating a fan of 9 extremely fluffy tails. Apparently, Naruto was so shell-shocked by hysteria that she did not see the obvious, that the fox in front of her was not an ordinary one, but a 9-tailed one. Catching sight of this visual fact, Naruto blinked back tears, again stifled her hysteria for a while and leaned forward to accurately count the animal's tails. She couldn't count them accurately the first time. The second time, too. Her eyes were swimming and blurring from sobbing, blurring the contours. Therefore, to accurately count them, she tried to stretch out her hands to the tails. The fox didn't like it, but he stoically endured until his tails were pulled, not at all gently. He growled gutturally, showing his irritation at this fact. Well, what animal would like to have its tails touched? Coo! Coo! Kurama? Uzumaki counted exactly 9 soft and fluffy tails. Woof, Fox confirmed with a yelp. In this form, he was not capable of more. Kyubi turned his muzzle to her and fixed her with a disapproving look. Kurama! You're alive! Before the fox could come to his senses, he was pressed against Uzumaki's chest and squeezed in the tight grip of her embrace. The joyful beating of her heart was almost deafening, and his sensitive hearing could easily catch its rhythm. It was so humiliating to be so small. Yes, he was alive, but not quite okay. Far from okay. He barely survived. That damn seal almost drained him dry. Look how much chakra was left. His size was the same as its volume. Horror! Small and weak. But his teeth were sharp. That's why he immediately slashed at his careless Jinchuriki. Once, twice, 3 times, and she kept pressing him to herself, even burying her nose in his fur, wiping her tears and snot on his skin. He had to suffer forever because of that Uzumaki.